She came to treat his wound, and said nothing of her own. Freya Ashdown had wrapped that same wound 3 times in 2 days, and each time the Alpha King had watched her hands instead of her face, as if the answer to what she was lay somewhere in the way she tied a bandage without being asked how. He did not know her name yet. He only knew that when the surgeon priests had backed away from the gash along his ribs, muttering about wolf fever and the wrongness of a wound that would not close, this small grey-eyed woman from the lower ward had simply stepped past them, knelt, and gone to work. She worked at the border fortress of Kelmarsh, where the Alpha King, Corwin Duskmere, held the northern line against raiders who came down out of the frost country every spring like a debt collector. It was not a court. There was no throne room, no velvet, no long tables of simpering lords. There was stone and mud, and the smell of tallow and horse, and a healer's tent that Freya had run, quietly and without credit, for 6 years. She had come to Kelmarsh as a girl of 19, sent by a dissolved household whose name meant nothing anymore, and she had made herself so useful and so unremarkable that most of the garrison could not have told you her surname. She changed dressings, she set bones, she boiled willow bark, and stitched gashes shut with fingers that did not shake even when the men screamed. She ate at the second sitting, slept in the healer's loft above the herb store, and had long ago made a careful, deliberate peace with being looked through. It was easier that way. It was safer that way. Nobody at Kelmarsh knew what she carried on her own body, wrapped tight beneath her healer's apron, changed only at night, alone, by candlelight, with her jaw clenched against the pain of it. Nobody knew because she had made certain of it. A healer who could not stand upright to work was a healer who would be sent away, or worse, sent home, and Freya did not have a home to be sent to. The wound on the Alpha King's ribs was 3 days old when she first laid hands on it, a raider's blade that should have killed him, and instead had only opened a long red line beneath skin that healed too slowly, as if something in him were fighting the healing rather than helping it. The garrison's physicians whispered about the old affliction, the wolf sickness that sometimes came over an alpha in a hard winter, when the beast beneath the man grew restless and refused to let the body mend the way it should. Nobody had seen it in Corwin Duskmere before. Nobody at Kelmarsh had seen it in any alpha for longer than the oldest soldier in the garrison had been alive. Freya did not know any of that history when she cleaned the wound the first time. She only knew that it was infected in a way that did not behave like any infection she had treated, that his fever ran hotter than a fever should, and yet his pulse stayed steady as a drum, and that when her fingers pressed the skin at the wound's edge, something under it seemed to still, the way a wild animal stills when it decides, against its instincts, not to run. He watched her from beneath heavy-lidded eyes, half delirious, half something else, and he said nothing while she worked, though his jaw was tight enough to crack. "You should be screaming," she told him quietly, because someone needed to say something, and the garrison's physicians had already fled the tent to argue among themselves outside. "Most men in your condition are." "I am not most men," he said, in a voice that came out rougher than intended, the voice of someone surprised to still have a voice at all. "No," she agreed, and did not look up from the wound. "You're the one who's going to sit still and let me finish, or you're going to bleed through this dressing by midnight, and we will do this again." He sat still. He did not know why he sat still. He was a man who had never in his adult life been ordered to do anything and simply obeyed. His beta captains did not order him. His war council did not order him. Even the old alpha who had raised him had learned, by the end, to phrase every instruction as a request. And yet this stranger from the lower ward, whose name he did not know, told him to sit still in a voice that expected to be obeyed, and something in him, something that was not entirely him, decided, without asking his permission, that it would obey. He did not understand the decision. He only understood that his wolf, which had not stirred for anything but battle and hunger in longer than he cared to remember, had gone very quiet and very attentive the moment her hands touched his skin, and that quiet was somehow louder than any snarl it had ever given him. She finished the dressing, told him to drink the willow tea whether he liked the taste or not, and left the tent without asking his name, because she already knew it, the way everyone at Kelmarsh knew it, and it had simply never occurred to her that knowing a man's name and mattering to him were different things. She did not think of the moment again that night. She had her own wound to attend to. It sat along her lower back, a burn she had taken 3 weeks earlier, pulling a wounded soldier free of a collapsed supply cart before the whole thing went up in the fire that had started from an overturned lamp. She had saved the soldier. She had not saved herself the trouble of a burn that had healed wrong, tight and shining and prone to splitting if she bent the wrong way, and she had told no one, because the fortress healer confessing to an unhealed wound of her own was the kind of thing that ended careers. So she wrapped it herself, gritted her teeth through the boiled water changes, and told herself it was improving. It was not improving, but it was not her business to notice that. It was her business to notice everyone else. The second day, the Alpha King's fever had not broken, and Freya returned to change the dressing, and found him awake and watching the tent flap the way a man watches a door he expects trouble to come through. "Lady Marchbane sent for the border physician from Dunwich," he said, without preamble, as if they had already been mid-conversation. "She does not trust a garrison healer with an Alpha's wound." Freya kept her eyes on the linen in her hands. "Lady Marchbane doesn't trust much of anything that isn't hers to control." It was the most opinion she had voiced about anyone in 6 years at Kelmarsh, and she regretted it the instant it left her mouth. Ceridwen Marchbane ran the fortress's provisioning and correspondence with a competence so total that half the garrison believed the place would collapse without her, and she had never once been unkind to Freya in any way that could be named or reported. She had simply, over 6 years, made certain that Freya's name never appeared on any list of merit, that any praise for the healer's tent went instead to the excellent management of the medical stores, and that Freya herself remained, in every official document that crossed Lady Marchbane's desk, a footnote. Corwin's eyes, which had been half closed against the fever, opened fully at that. "You've thought about her." "I've thought about how she runs this fortress," Freya said. "It's not the same thing." He almost smiled. It hurt to do it, with the fever cracking his lips, but something in his chest had not almost smiled at anything in a very long time, and the wolf beneath his skin noted the sensation with the same startled attention it had given her hands the day before. He asked her name then, finally, and she told him, Freya Ashdown, 6 years in the healer's tent. No titles, no house worth naming, and he said it back once, quietly, as if testing whether it fit something. It fit something. He did not tell her that. He did not know how to tell her that, or even whether it was a thing that ought to be told, when the last time an alpha of his line had felt his wolf go still and attentive around a woman it had been, according to the old fortress archives, 312 years, a fact he did not yet know, because he had not yet had reason to ask the archivist, and would not, for 2 more days. That night, the burn on Freya's back split along its worst seam while she was climbing the loft ladder, and she bit down hard enough on her own sleeve to keep from making a sound that would carry through the herb store below. She sat on the floor of her small room until the worst of it passed, then cleaned it herself, wrapped it in fresh linen with hands that trembled this time, and told the ceiling, in a whisper, that it would be fine by morning. It was not fine by morning. She simply put on her apron over it and went to work, because that was what she did, and because the Alpha King's fever had not broken, and there was no one else in that fortress who could be trusted to keep him alive. The old archivist, a stooped, sharp-eyed man named Emrys Cole, who had outlived 3 Alphas and cared for the good opinion of exactly none of them, found Corwin sitting up on the 3rd morning, still fevered but improving, and studied him with the particular attention of a man who has just noticed something he has been waiting 3 centuries to notice. "Your wolf has gone quiet," Emrys said, without asking permission to speak first, which no one else in the fortress would have dared. "Not sick quiet, listening quiet. I have read of it. I did not think I would live to see it. See what? Corwin said, though something in his chest already suspected the answer. The last time a wolf of your bloodline went still like that, Emrys said, was for the last Alpha Queen this fortress ever had. 312 years ago, if the ledgers are honest, and my ledgers are always honest. He tapped the arm of Corwin's cot with one knuckle. It does not go still for fever. It does not go still for pain. It goes still, my king, when it has found something it has been waiting for considerably longer than either of us has been alive. Corwin said nothing for a long moment. Then, the healer. Emrys did not confirm it. He did not need to. He simply said, ask her what she carries on her own back before you ask her anything else, and left the tent before Corwin could demand how the old man knew there was anything to ask about at all. Corwin did not understand the instruction until the fourth day, when Freya came to change his dressing, and reaching for the linen roll on the low table, moved the wrong way, too fast, and the sharp intake of breath she gave was not for his wound, it was for hers. He caught it, the flinch, the way her hand went briefly, involuntarily, to the small of her back, before she forced it away and back to her work, as if nothing had happened. Show me, he said. It's nothing, she said, in the same flat, competent voice she used to tell frightened soldiers that a wound looked worse than it was. You've been treating a wound of your own for 3 weeks, he said, and watched her still, exactly the way his wolf had stilled around her, and you have said nothing of it to anyone in this entire fortress, including the healer whose job it is to notice these things. Which is you, which means no one has been noticing you. That's not... She started and stopped, because there was no honest end to that sentence. Show me, he said again, quieter this time, and something in the way he said it was not a command from an alpha to a subject. It was closer to a request from a man who had, 3 days into a fever that would not break, found the one thing in his life his wolf had ever gone quiet for, and did not intend to lose it to a wound she had hidden out of habit. She showed him. The burn was worse than 3 weeks of neglect should have made it. Split, weeping, edged in red that had begun, in the last day, to creep outward in a way that told Corwin, even in his own fevered state, exactly how close she had come to letting this kill her out of sheer stubbornness and a lifetime of practice at not being seen. He did not shout at her. He did not command the physicians in the way she had half expected, half braced for. He simply sat forward, despite his own wound protesting the movement, and said, in a voice gone rough with something that was not fever, "You saved a man from a burning cart 3 weeks ago, and told no one you paid for it with your own skin." He had a wife, she said, as if that were an explanation, which to her it was. And you had no one to tell, Corwin said. It was not a question. She did not answer that. She did not need to. The answer was written into 6 years of eating at the second sitting and sleeping in a loft above the herb store, and being, in every official record Lady Marchbane had ever filed, a footnote. He called for the physicians himself. Then, not Lady Marchbane's outside expert from Dunwich, but the fortress's own, and stood over them, wound in his own side notwithstanding, until they treated Freya's burn with the same care they had given his. And when Lady Marchbane arrived to ask, with perfect civility, why the Alpha King was expending his authority on a healer's minor injury, he answered her in front of the assembled garrison in a voice that carried to every corner of the yard. Because for 6 years this fortress has survived on her hands, and given her nothing for it, not even the courtesy of noticing when those hands were bleeding, he said. That ends today. Lady Marchbane's expression did not change. It never did, in public. She simply inclined her head, murmured something about the Alpha King's evident exhaustion, clouding his judgment, and withdrew to her ledgers, where she began, quietly and methodically, to build the case that would nearly destroy Freya 3 weeks later. That was the trouble with Cerridwen Marchbane. She was never cruel where anyone could see it. She used petitions and precedent and the fortress's own supply records, all of it filed correctly, all of it defensible on paper, all of it aimed at proving that the healer's tent had been mismanaged for years, and that its keeper, untrained, untitled, unaccountable, had been operating in violation of a dozen minor regulations that nobody enforced until the moment it became useful to enforce them. Freya, healing, did not know any of that yet. She knew only that for the first time in 6 years, someone had looked at her hands and asked what they cost her, and that the asking had unsettled something in her chest that she did not have a name for and was almost afraid to examine too closely. Corwin's fever broke on the 5th day, all at once, the way Emrys had said it would once the wolf settled into whatever understanding it had reached. He woke clear-eyed for the first time in 5 days to find Freya asleep in the chair beside his cot, exhausted from tending 2 wounds at once, her own burn finally dressed properly, her hand still resting near the edge of his cot, as if she had reached for his pulse in her sleep and simply left it there. He watched her for a long time before he woke her. He did not understand yet everything his wolf had decided about her. He understood only that watching her sleep in that chair felt like the first quiet moment his chest had held in longer than he could remember, and that he did not want it to end. When she woke, startled, apologizing for having fallen asleep at her post, he told her not to apologize for the first genuinely restful sleep either of them had had in a week, and something in the way he said it made her laugh, a short, surprised sound, as if laughing were a skill she had not exercised in a long time and had forgotten she still possessed. It was, Emrys would say later, the moment the whole fortress began to notice, though neither of them noticed it themselves. A healer, laughing at the Alpha King's bedside, was not, on its own, remarkable. But the way the king's own men began to watch her differently in the days that followed, the way the loyal Beta, Torvin Reyes, took to greeting her by name in the mess hall when he had never once done so in 6 years, the way the lowest-ranked soldiers began, without discussion, to defer to her in small ways that had nothing to do with medicine. That was harder to explain, and harder still to ignore. The pack, Emrys observed, had begun to decide about her before its alpha had finished deciding for himself. Freya noticed the change, and did not know what to do with it. She had spent 6 years cultivating invisibility as carefully as other women cultivated beauty or wealth, because invisibility, in a border fortress with no family behind her and no claim to protect her, had been the only armor she could afford. Being seen felt, at first, like standing in an open field during a storm, exposed, unprotected, waiting for the lightning to find her. It found her 3 weeks later. In the form of a formal inquiry, Lady Marchbane filed with the Fortress Council, alleging that the healer's tent's supply losses over the past 2 years, losses that existed on paper, because Freya had never once claimed reimbursement for herbs and linens she had quietly purchased herself when the official stores ran short, amounted to a pattern of misappropriation serious enough to warrant her removal from post pending investigation. It was, on paper, unimpeachable. Lady Marchbane had built it from real numbers, real gaps in the ledgers, real omissions that Freya herself had created out of a habit of covering shortfalls rather than drawing attention to them. It was the kind of accusation that could not be waved away by royal favour alone, because it was not built on favour. It was built on the fortress's own rules, turned against the one person who had never once broken them for her own benefit. Corwin, hearing of it, wanted to override the council outright, and Emrys was the one who stopped him. "If you strike this down by decree," the old archivist said, "you prove nothing except that you can protect a woman you favour. Lady Marchbane will simply wait and try again with cleaner numbers. Let the council examine the ledgers properly. Let Freya answer for herself. She has never once lied about anything in this fortress in 6 years. Trust that the truth, laid out plainly, is stronger than your authority alone." It was not the answer Corwin wanted, and it was, he came to understand, the only answer that would actually protect her. The council convened in the fortress's long hall. cold stone and torchlight, and the particular hush of a room that has gathered to watch something important happen to someone it has mostly ignored until now. Freya stood before them in her healer's apron, because she owned no finer clothes, and had refused, when Corwin offered, to borrow anything that would make her look like something she was not. Lady Marchbane laid out her case, with the same careful civil precision she brought to everything. The missing sums, the unclaimed reimbursements, the pattern that, presented coldly on a page, looked exactly like theft. "I did not claim reimbursement," Freya said, when it was her turn to answer, "because the fortress's supply budget was always tightest in the months after the spring raids, and I did not think it right to draw from stores that soldiers' families needed more than I did. Every shortfall in that ledger is herbs and linens I paid for from my own wages. I have the receipts from the Kelmarsh apothecary going back 4 years, if the council wishes to see them." She had, in fact, kept every receipt, not out of foresight, but out of the same instinct that made her track every dressing change and every dose, a healer's habit of recording what she did, whether or not anyone would ever ask to see it. She laid the receipts on the council table herself, 4 years of small, careful proof that she had spent her own coin covering gaps no one had ever thanked her for closing. Lady Marchbane's composure did not break, not fully, not in front of the council. But something in her eyes shifted when the receipts hit the table. Not fury, not the outrage of the falsely accused, but something closer to the recognition of a woman watching a case she had built with real skill collapse under evidence she had not anticipated, because she had never imagined that anyone as unregarded as Freya Ashdown would have kept such careful records of her own invisibility. The council's ruling came within the hour. The inquiry was dismissed. Lady Marchbane's petition was struck from the fortress's formal record, and a quieter, more damaging note was entered instead, that the provisioning officer had brought a serious accusation against a member of the garrison without first verifying the ledgers she claimed to manage so carefully, a failure that would follow her long after the scandal itself faded. She did not weep. She did not protest. She simply thanked the council for their time, in the same formally civil voice she used for everything, and withdrew, diminished, not destroyed, exactly the way a woman who has spent years building a position out of competence rather than cruelty is diminished when that competence is finally shown to have a crack in it. The garrison talked about it for days afterward, in the way garrisons talk about anything that shifts the ground beneath a place they thought they understood. Some of the soldiers had liked Lady Marchbane, in the distant way one likes an efficient system rather than a person, and grumbled that the healer had gotten lucky with her receipts. Torvin Reyes put an end to that particular grumbling within a day, informing anyone who would listen that he had personally watched Freya document every dose and every purchase for 6 years without once being asked to, and that a woman who kept that kind of record out of habit rather than fear had never needed luck at all. Emrys, for his part, took to visiting the healer's tent more often than his research strictly required, ostensibly to consult his ledgers against her own records, and Freya came to understand, over several long afternoons of tea and old fortress history, that the archivist had been quietly rooting for her long before anyone else in Kelmarsh had thought to notice her at all. He told her, one such afternoon, about the last Alpha Queen the fortress had known, a healer herself, if the old accounts were accurate, though the details had blurred across 3 centuries into something closer to legend than history. They never wrote down her name properly, Emrys said, turning the brittle pages of a ledger older than the fortress's current stones. Only that she came from nothing anyone could trace, and that the wolves of this line went quiet the moment she set her hands to a wound. I begin to think that is simply how it works. Not crowns, not bloodlines, hands that know how to be steady when everything else refuses to be. Freya thought about that a great deal in the days that followed, turning it over the way she turned over any new information, carefully, without hurry, testing its edges before deciding what to do with it. She did not think of herself as anything like a queen, old or new. She thought of herself as a woman who had learned, out of necessity, how to make herself small enough to survive a place that had no room allotted for her, and she was not entirely certain, even now, how to unlearn 6 years of that particular skill. Corwin found Freya afterward in the healer's tent, back at work, as if nothing had happened, because that was what she did. She worked, whatever else the day had held. "You could have told me about the receipts before the hearing," he said. "I would have known you were safe." "I didn't want you to intervene," she said, not looking up from the herbs she was sorting. "I wanted them to see that I didn't need you to." He understood that, more than she perhaps expected him to. He had spent his whole life being an alpha, whose authority solved problems before anyone had the chance to solve them for themselves, and something in him, the same something that had gone quiet and listening the first day she touched his wound, recognized in her insistence on solving her own problem, a kind of strength his title had never taught him to value properly until now. "Emrys tells me my wolf hasn't gone still like this in 312 years, he said, because it was easier to say the fact plainly than to say what the fact meant. "I know," Freya said. "He told me too, yesterday, while you were in council. And what do you make of it?" She set down the herbs and finally looked at him, and there was nothing invisible in the way she did it. "I make of it that I've spent 6 years being very good at not being noticed, and somehow the one creature in this fortress that isn't entirely under your control decided to notice me anyway. I don't know what to do with that." "Neither do I," he admitted. "I've never had to. Nothing has asked anything of me that wasn't a war or a treaty in 12 years of ruling this line." "This isn't a war," she said, "or a treaty." "No," he agreed. "It's considerably more frightening than either." She laughed again, that same short, surprised sound, and this time he let himself smile back without the fever to blame it on, and something between them settled into place the way the burn on her back had finally, properly, begun to heal. Slowly, honestly, without hiding it from anyone anymore. In the weeks that followed, the garrison watched the change happen, the way garrisons watch everything, without comment and with total attention. The Alpha King began taking his meals near the healer's tent, rather than the officers' hall. Freya began, for the first time in 6 years, eating at the first sitting, because Torvin Reyes had simply started pulling out a chair for her there, and daring anyone to object. Lady Marchbane, quietly and without ceremony, requested reassignment to Kelmarsh's southern outpost within the month, a transfer Corwin approved without argument, because a diminished woman given a graceful exit was, Emrys pointed out, a cleaner resolution than a public humiliation would have been, and Corwin found, to his own mild surprise, that he agreed. The burn on Freya's back healed into a long, pale scar she no longer bothered to hide, because there was no longer anyone in that fortress she needed to hide it from. She wore it the way she wore everything else about herself now, plainly, without apology, a mark of a night she had chosen to save someone else and paid for it herself, which was, Corwin told her once, quietly, in the dark, the truest thing about her he had learned in all the weeks since her hands first touched his wound. "You never once told me it hurt," he said. "You had your own wound," she said. "Someone had to be steady." "You could let someone be steady for you now," he said, "if you wanted." She thought about that for a long moment. 6 years of practice, at not needing anyone standing against something new and unfamiliar, and she found not unwelcome. "I could," she said. "I think I'd like to try." Autumn came to Kelmarsh the way it always did, early and hard, frost silvering the practice yard by the second week, and the fortress settled into the particular rhythm of a border post preparing for winter. Stores counted, walls checked, the healer's tent restocked well before the first real cold. Freya oversaw the restocking herself, as she always had, except that this year the requisition carried her name on it plainly, in the fortress's own ledger, Healer of Kelmarsh, no longer a footnote to anyone's management of the medical stores. Corwin found her there on a grey morning, arranging jars of dried willow bark and yarrow with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, simply watching her work the way he had once watched her sleeping in a chair beside his cot, as if the sight itself was something he did not want to interrupt. She caught him watching and did not pretend not to notice, because pretending not to be noticed was not a habit she needed anymore. "You're doing the thing again," she said, "where you stand in doorways instead of walking in." "My wolf does that," he said, "watches before it decides to come closer. Emrys says it's the last of the old caution, 300 years of not trusting anything enough to walk straight toward it. And now? Now it walks straight toward you," he said, and did, crossing the small tent to stand beside her at the herb table, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him without either of them needing to say anything more about it. They did not marry with ceremony that year, though the fortress celebrated it as if they had a hearth-bonding in the old way, in front of the pack rather than a court, Emrys presiding with the particular satisfaction of a man who had waited 3 centuries to officiate exactly this, Torvin standing witness with a grin he made no effort to hide, and the whole garrison turning out in the practice yard to watch their alpha take the healer's hand in front of everyone who had, for 6 years, walked past her without seeing her at all. Freya wore her scars plainly that day, the old burn along her back and the newer, smaller marks of a life spent tending other people's wounds, and nobody in that yard looked at her as a footnote. They looked at her the way the wolf had looked at her from the very first day, in the tent, fevered and half delirious and stilled beyond its own understanding, as the thing it had been waiting 312 years to find. Winter settled over Kelmarsh in earnest by midwinter, and the healer's tent grew warm and steady against it, better stocked than it had ever been, its keeper no longer counting every jar of willow bark against a ledger that would never thank her for it. Corwin took to spending his evenings there when the day's business allowed, not as the Alpha King inspecting his fortress, but simply as a man who had found, in a stone room that smelled of dried herbs and tallow candles, the first place in his adult life that felt like a home rather than a post to be held. Freya kept her records the way she always had, precise and unglamorous, a healer's habit that had once been the only proof of her existence in a fortress that overlooked her, and was now simply the shape of her days, dressings changed, doses measured, small kindnesses logged in a private ledger only she ever read, because some habits outlast the need that created them and become instead simply who a person is. On the coldest night of that first winter, with snow banked against the tent walls and the garrison settled into its long midwinter quiet, Corwin asked her, half in jest and half not, whether she had ever imagined, in all her years of quietly saving this fortress from itself, that it would end with an Alpha King learning to sit still, because she told him to. "No," she said, threading a needle by candlelight for no reason, except the habit of always having something in her hands. "I imagined I'd grow old in that loft above the herb store and nobody would ever notice when I stopped." "Somebody noticed," he said. "Somebody's wolf noticed first," she said, and took its time telling the rest of him. 312 years is a long time to wait, he said. I like to think it was worth being particular. She set the needle down and looked at him, this man who had once been to her only a name and a title and a distant figure whose scale made rooms feel smaller, and who was now simply Corwin, sitting close enough by the fire that she no longer had to reach for his pulse to know it was steady. He did not answer right away. He watched the fire instead, turning the question over with the same seriousness he gave to matters of war and border treaties, because he understood, by now, that she rarely asked anything. She had not already spent a long while considering herself. "I would like to say yes," he admitted finally. "I would like to say my wolf would have known her anywhere, wound or no wound, hidden or not. But I think the truth is smaller and less flattering than that. I think most people walk past most wounds every day of their lives, mine included, until something forces them to stop and look properly. I was fortunate that mine forced me to stop for you. I don't know that I've earned the right to promise I'd have stopped for anyone else." "That's an honest answer," Freya said. I'd have trusted you less if you'd given me a prettier one. I've learned that from you, he said. 6 years of this fortress, giving you nothing but honest work and no credit for it, and somehow you never once decided honesty wasn't worth the trouble. It was the only thing I had that was entirely mine, she said. I wasn't going to spend it carelessly. Outside, the wind came down off the northern ridge, the way it always did in deep winter, rattling the tent poles and driving the last of the daylight out of the sky an hour before it should have gone, and inside, the healer's tent held its small, steady warmth the way it always had. Jars of dried herbs on their shelves, a needle and thread set down half-finished by the fire, a ledger open to a page, with her name written plainly across the top of it, no longer a footnote to anyone. Freya picked the needle back up, because some habits do not disappear simply because the reason for them has changed, and Corwin watched her do it with the same quiet attention his wolf had given her from the very first day, fevered and disbelieving, in a tent much like this one. If your wolf had waited 312 years for someone, she said at last, setting the thought down as plainly as she set down every other true thing she carried, and she'd spent every one of those years hiding her own wounds so well that nobody thought to look, would you have found her anyway? Or would some part of you always wonder how many others you walked past without noticing, before hers was the one that finally made you stop? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.